It's me again. Going to talk a little bit more about Rust Belt. And, picking up where I left off, I think people in the regions, in Rust Belt cities and Rust Belt region in general, there is a sense of being left behind, disregarded, unappreciated by the larger glitz and glamour world of the coasts and how they operate. And the Rust Belt, that's funny because there's a great deal of stoic pride in terms of surviving. A lot, Rust Belt folk are resilient because they've had to be. They're realistic because there hasn't been a lot of hope. The golden age of the Rust Belt was before it was the Rust Belt. Again, was in the manufacturing boom, the post-war, meaning World War II, post-war manufacturing boom, when everything was cranking and churning, and union membership was very high, and factories were cranking away. But as the United States progressively de-invested and moved away from the manufacturing, and that all went to China. Thanks, Reagan. That evolution or de-evolution produced that vibe that became central to Rust Belt. And it's funny, it's manifested in a lot of different ways. In the 70s, there was a lot of really good music that came out of Cleveland. You had bands like Pere Ubu, Rocket from the Tombs before Pere Ubu. You had Devo, right, in Akron. You had the Dead Boys originated, and they came from that that sort of region, that Rust Belt vibe. Any number of Detroit bands, I can go into that. This is all music that I'm talking about, but the music is kind of part of it. There's a loyalty Rust Belt folk have for the things that grew up in the Rust Belt. And it may not manifest as much in literature as the other areas that I mentioned, like Southern fiction, etc. That Rust Belt folk may not be as interested in literature as they might be into sports. But there is a loyalty and pride that's inherent in that Rust Belt sensibility. Excuse me. And I have absolutely tried to do my part to bring that to life in some of my stories, a number of my stories, because it's a little bit. I'll admit there's a bit of my own pride in that sense of kind of like, yeah, you guys are keen to ignore us, but we're still here. We're still here. We haven't gone yet. We haven't disappeared entirely. So, when I grew up in Ohio in the 70s and 80s. And it was a very different place back then where I grew up. It was a very different place. And that all started to come unglued, in the 90s and the aughts, to the extent that Ohio is almost like a punchline now, which is sad. It's unfortunate because there's a lot of beautiful stuff in Ohio, Pennsylvania too. And I always feel personally, as someone who grew up in northeastern Ohio, specifically Youngstown, that we kind of caucus east. That the difference between somebody who grew up in northeastern Ohio versus southern or southern central Ohio, they kind of, to my mind, caucus a little more west, even though ostensibly they're under the shadow of the Rust Belt. But their way of being is, again, northeastern Ohio folk, I think, are far more eastern in the way they operate. Like I always kind of squint and I see people who are from New Jersey, and I always feel like I think that they could probably get along reasonably well with some Rust Belt folk, because there's an edge there, and I don't think it's even really fully been expressed. I've done it in a number of books. I've tried to capture some of that vibe. But I feel like there's a lot of untapped stuff that one could pull. And another thing, and I'll probably deal with this in another clip, is the influence of the Appalachian Mountains. Like that is almost a ghost. It's almost there. And like I said, I'll talk more about that in a minute.